This is Play Again, a VOD review abridged series where I focus on concepts based on a game or a match that's played and re-examine the match to see if we can learn more about what happened or what transpired. Obviously, the clickbait title of this one is Suning won in draft, but mostly what I'm looking at is the interaction between the compositions played by Suning and TES in the very first series of LPL 2021 Spring. Specifically, we'll talk about the interactions between TES's all-in short-range composition and Suning's longer-range composition with a lot of CC that punishes choke points. We'll also talk about the adaptation that TES made and why it didn't work and if it could have if they had executed better. Brief discussion of the draft. TES picked Samira, Leona, and Pantheon as their first three picks on blue side, which already is a very short-range composition. So it immediately opens up an opportunity for Suning to respond to that. They go Aatrox. One of the pitfalls of Aatrox is that he is also a low-range champion, but if you're already committing into him, it's easy for him to set up for Qs, use his chain to pull people closer to him, and just deal a lot of chaos and damage. He also has a lot of sustain, so you're basically trying to burst him and one-shot him, which is really hard to do the longer the game goes on. They also pick Nidalee, who's going to be very good at kiting, creating space, and just looking for poke in general. Following that, they end up picking Galio and Victor. So the reason why Galio and Victor are the core to why the Suning composition works is because as soon as you commit into something, if Galio taunts you, you're locked into place. It's easier for Aatrox to follow up, for Kai'Sa to follow up, for you to basically end up deleted in that situation. You also have Victor, who's going to layer down the gravity field in that situation and then put ulti for a great deal of damage. So that combination is going to really hinder what TES want to do. Obviously, the answer to that is probably going to be to build some kind of Mercury Treads or Tenacity, but of course, in that situation, you're going to be more susceptible to damage from Kai'Sa and Aatrox. TES tried to combat this by picking Syndra, whose E basically just creates a lot of problems for short-range compositions to break the distance, but again, we have already Nidalee in place, we have Victor, and if TES are the ones engaging with Leona Pantheon, then that's not really a situation that Syndra mitigates too much. Also, we have Karma top, who's going to be able to provide a shield for when Samira all ends, but really, that's not going to do that much to help out the situation overall, which we'll get into a little bit later. So let's talk a little bit about how TES want to play out their composition. I saw a lot of analysis discuss how it was basically a very early game focus comp, and they needed to make something happen around bottom. So we can debate the early game focus nature of the comp and everything else in discussion, but the biggest thing is I just don't think it's possible for TES to properly make anything happen around bottom. Let's see how they try to set up this play. So the wave is pushing for Suning into TES's side. They know that Kai'Sa is pathing around bottom, so they've probably called SFN to hover to help them get the wave in. In a minute, we see Joe initiate into the Galio taunt right away, and then he responds with a Justice Punch. So before they even can try to get on top of Huanfeng, there's already a ridiculous amount of damage done to them, and they're forced to back off and SN win this little trade to be able to get their wave in and force a reset situation. Okay, so now let's just talk about the full interaction of the composition. We only talked about how Galio is basically mitigating a lot of the playmaking that could have happened around bottom lane. The fact that Samira and Leona duo with Pantheon really want to all in, and Galio kind of cockblocks that. So we're going to, first of all, see Suning playing the longer range composition with more poke, coming from Nidalee, getting vision down and setting up first, which isn't always consistent. Second, we see Galio already blowing his taunt, but the fact of the matter is that Galio can follow up with the ultimate, and Angel is just around the corner, setting up the gravity field, setting up the ultimate, and dealing a ridiculous amount of damage when TES commit almost one by one. I've used and coined the term before of conveyor belt feeding to hasten Suning's win. So let's talk about Karma. Obviously, Karma was picked as a way to kind of mitigate the damage from Suning after Samira all-ins, assuming Samira could snowball, which I already feel like she couldn't. But let's just take a look at the Karma E to see how likely that is. So if you go Karma E and you pick Moonstone Renewer, which obviously 369 didn't, but let's say for the sake of argument that he went Moonstone Renewer, about how much damage mitigation do we think that we could have off of a Karma Shield? So with bonus shield plus, AP from Ludens Tempest and Amp Tome, we could be a little bit generous and say a little bit over 500 damage mitigation, plus the heal from Moonstone Renewer would be around 90, and this guy probably, assuming that he stays in combat, that the healing can stack up quite a bit, but let's talk about whether or not we actually think he'll stay in combat. So this is a nice damage calculator made by Chrysalix that I'll link below. And this just shows Victor's all-in damage, given the items that Samira has, right? She's probably not going to itemize too much for MR or anything along those lines, and she definitely didn't build Merc Treads for CC mitigation, as we discussed before. So just looking at Victor's all-in, which calculates the DPS plus the damage that each individual ability is doing with the items that he had at the 19-minute mark when the fight occurred, you have about 1,577 damage. And that's just the Victor, so I don't see the shield from Karma and the situation that we discussed, actually plus Moonstone Renewer, ever saving her from Victor plus Kaisa plus Aatrox if she's just really going ham and going super deep. You can also start adding things like, the Pantheon shield or anything along those lines to cancel out some of the damage, but overall, Samira wants to get in there, plus Samira W, all of those other factors, but overall, just Samira wants to really get in there, and if she gets disrupted by the Galio taunt, anything along those lines, she's just really going to have a really terrible time and have a difficulty playing into the composition that Suning have on offer. So what do you do about that, right? That's the question. How do you solve that problem? Because just building Karma, trying to build a small shield that's not even going to protect you from one champion's all-in one spell rotation is not going to do a whole lot for your overall approach. Do you decide to adapt, maybe not pick as much all-in, shift away from the Samira? Of course not, because we're at Top Esports and we have to double down on everything. However, they did make an adaptation, and that's more about what we're going to talk about in Game 2. First, we see TS adapting by banning a lot of the short-range bruisers that will disrupt Samira when she all-ins. So that's signaling that they're not really necessarily changing their strategy. They're just looking to make it so that Suning's topside can't really hurt TES too much once they've hard committed. They also end up banning the Galio in second phase, which I think is really huge, very helpful from that perspective. But the main thing to notice here is that in response to Camille, they're picking up Jax. That's going to give them a lot more flexibility in their composition. One of the main issues with the TES draft in the previous situation is that they had picked Karma. And Karma, Syndra, they don't necessarily give you a lot of ability to answer champions like Aatrox or Victor in the side lane as the game goes on, so basically TES had no choice but to look for 5v5s constantly. Whereas with Jax, you at least have the idea of, okay, we're going to be able to push out really far on one side. We have Oriana to hold mid. We also have Samira, who can do a lot of damage in the side lane and create a lot of space. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to hard snowball a side laner, and we're going to send all of our all-in guys, our Hecarim, our Alistar, to that side of the map, and we're going to look for picks based on controlling vision and setting things up. So that's how you would want to play this adaptation. Now, of course, you still have a lot of the answers that Suning did. They changed out the Galio for the Maokai, who has the ultimate that does create a lot of space and does end up disengaging if you're able to latch onto people with those tendrils. It's not quite as effective as the Galio because it actually does, the Maokai ulti actually doesn't go through Samira W, so things like that make it a slightly less useful pick, but then you also have the victim. So if you're committing to 5v5s, it's still not great. And then you also have Lilia, who's going to be kiting really well. You also have Hecarim, who's going to have a little bit of an easier time all-inning, because he can just pass the gravity field for Victor, get into the back line, past all of the frontline defenses of Suning. So this is just, we're going to all-in harder, we're going to all-in better, and this is what we learned from Game 1. Now, there were a lot of genuinely positive moments for Top Esports in terms of their apparent understanding of how to execute their composition. You have TES and Karsa making a play on one side, meanwhile simultaneously shifting the rest of the team down to secure vision on that side while TES, Karsa, and Jackie Love recall. In this situation, they're forcing Suning to respond to them topside to try to retake or push out that wave all the way, while TES set up to take their real objective, which is dropping Rift and securing bot tier 2. Just a couple minutes later, this play is in fruition. They trade top tier 1 in exchange for bot tier 2, plus they managed to pick up the second dragon. There are a couple of reasons why this didn't really work out for them overall, though. I think Suning had a pretty good read on what TES wanted to do from draft, and they were able to really prevent the volatile matchup from snowballing in TES's favor. SFM was almost consistently to the top side before Karsa was, setting TES 369 much further behind than need be. Of course, Karsa picked up the response kills, but he's not really their win condition as much as 369 being able to create a lot of space and push really far in a side lane to draw pressure. He wasn't really able to keep up with Bin's Camille for most of the game, and that didn't work out for them. In general, I think TES was able to use tempo to set up a lot of situations where Suning were dragged across the map, and as a result, TES got a lot of good picks off on them, or were able to set up fights in their favor. However, as the game dragged on, either because of Dro's inexperience or just because of TES's natural tendency, they pretty much just couldn't help themselves, and they overcommitted again in a lot of chokes where Suning were able to use a lot of their composition's natural strengths to clean up. I think this series was a pretty good look from both Suning and TES. TES showed a little bit of a difference in what they wanted to do, perhaps because of Dro or other factors. They're playing a lot more short-range LPL-esque style compositions, when historically I think TES were more the team, as Dagda pointed out on the broadcast, to play a lot of these long-range disengage kiting compositions. You saw them do it against Suning in the first game of the World Championship semifinal, though they didn't really play it how I would think they would play it. But I also really liked some of the looks from Game 2, where they were kind of juggling side lane pressure, just really on top of their resets, and then it just all went to shit. So maybe with a little bit more time and practice, we'll see more consistency coming out with this type of method of playing with, okay, we're just going to commit a lot of resources to one side. We're going to force Suning sort of follow us across the map from behind tempo. And then, of course, Suning showing the adaptation and the ability to adjust the way that they're playing based on what the enemy composition is doing made them pretty unique at the World Championship, and I think a lot of people attributed it to Sword Art, so them retaining kind of that identity or understanding what TS want to do and preventing that from happening in both games, I think is a really good sign, and makes me excited to watch both teams as the League of Legends Pro League continues.